handling the intermittency and the overproduction. So I'm super excited to be here because I think this is one of the last building blocks to much more deployable solar and wind.
Thanks, Bernie. Next up, Enrique.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Enrique Walsh. I'm the head of innovation here in Avangrid. Avangrid is a utility. We serve more than 7 million people in the Northeast region. And also we are the third largest operator of renewable energy in the US. We belong to the Iberdrola group. Within Iberdrola, we have developed some hydrogen projects in Europe, particularly in Spain, where we develop and we are operating the biggest plant in Europe right now. So very, very happy to be here and contribute to this working group.
Thanks, Enrique. Next up, Elias.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elias Animas. I'm another consultant with Strategy, and I'll be supporting this group. Thanks.
Thanks, Elias. Aaron, next.
Hi, folks. Erin Childs with Strategy and Consulting. Excited to be joining today.
Thanks. Kaya.
Hi, Kai here. I'm also on the team of Strategy. Really happy to be here.
Kaya. Mary.
Hi, folks. Wheezy Nuara. I go by Wheezy. My real name is Mary Louise, but feel free to call me Wheezy. I'm the State Policy Director for New England at Dominion Energy. I represent, of course, Millstone Nuclear Power Station, which sits in Waterford, Connecticut. It is the largest source of carbon-free electricity in all of New England, producing about 16 to 17 million megawatt hours of carbon-free electricity each year. So I'm happy to help contribute to the discussion surrounding sources of clean hydrogen. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Wheezy. I see Nathan next.
Yeah, hi, Nathan Furling, Director of External Affairs for the Nature Conservancy in Connecticut. We're interested in strategies for decarbonizing hard to decarbonize sectors like aviation, marine transport, and so forth. And we're also very concerned that hydrogen is something that we approach very carefully and thoroughly as far as making sure that it is truly green, while we also try to make it a potential solution for those hard to decarbonize sectors. So good to be here today as a guest.
Thanks, Nathan. Lydia.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lydia, research analyst with Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. It goes without saying that we are very excited with the task force work and especially with the working group efforts.
Thanks. Samantha.
Hi, thanks. Sam Danowski. Use she, her pronouns. I'm the state director of the Sierra Club's Connecticut chapter. And the Sierra Club is, committed to addressing climate change with just and equitable solutions here in Connecticut. We're working to get Connecticut on track to meet our greenhouse gas reduction commitments. And happy to be here. Good to see everybody.
Thanks, Sam. And finally, Tyler.
I think Tyler shared in the chat that they don't have a microphone camera available, that they are a member of the public and listening in.
Oh, I see. Thanks for joining, Tyler. All right. We've all had a chance. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, before we get going, I just wanted to let folks know that these meetings are recorded and we'll also be taking meeting minutes. So just wanted to make sure folks are aware of that and sort of comfortable with that part of the process. Back to you, Colin.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, important note. But now that we've all had a chance to get acquainted, I'll start walking through the agenda for the meeting, starting out with overview and introductions, which we just completed, so we're moving along right on schedule. Next, we wanted to spend 10 minutes to review the working group charter and schedule, which was approved at the last task force meeting for the hydrogen task force in Connecticut, and go through some of the deliverables, some of the questions that this charter will be answering, and then get any questions or thoughts from everyone on this call about the charter that may be outstanding since it was approved. Oops. Oh, I guess I don't have a slide here for the deliverables, but I can. The charter was sent out yesterday as a PDF, so hopefully people have had a chance to look at that charter that was in their inbox. I can also pull it up on the screen so that we can walk through it in real time for those who haven't had a chance to see it.
Maybe we can provide a brief overview of key elements of the charter, and then if folks have questions, do a more detailed walkthrough. Does that sound useful to everyone?
Mhm.
Okay.
So I just wanted to start with the deliverables for the charter, which are going to be, I think, some of the most important elements to be aware of as we kind of start this investigation into potential opportunities for hydrogen production in Connecticut. You can see that here near the on the start of the second page of the sources working group charter. So first, in collaboration with the Policy and Workforce Development Working Group, this team will be involved in developing a definition for clean hydrogen. What exactly does it mean for hydrogen to be clean? What are the requirements for the different energy feedstocks that could be used to produce hydrogen? And how do we make sure that this solution is in line with Connecticut's climate goals? Then we're going to be doing some analysis, or a strategy will be some supporting conducting some analysis with your support on the total production potential for clean hydrogen within Connecticut, developed across at least 3 scenarios. We're also going to be looking at the impact on the local manufacturing potential in Connecticut to develop the electrolyzers that would be used to actually turn renewable electricity, clean electricity, into hydrogen. Connecticut has deep roots in the electrolyzer industry. A number of electrolyzer manufacturers are based here. And so one goal of this working group is to understand if electrolyzers are going to be used in Connecticut to produce green hydrogen, clean hydrogen. What can we do to make sure those electrolyzers are produced locally in such a way that supports the local economy as well? Next, in collaboration or in deference to action by other state agencies, we can compare Connecticut's hydrogen production potential to other Northeast states in the regional clean hydrogen hub to understand where Connecticut's hydrogen production potential fits in to the overall hydrogen production ecosystem in the Northeast, and what role it can kind of play in this larger effort. And then we'll be looking at some scenarios around different costs that clean hydrogen could be produced at based on the cost of underlying energy feedstocks to get a sense of what types of production methods would be most cost effective and allow hydrogen to be a more competitive clean fuel against traditional alternatives. So I'll pause there and see if anyone has any questions on these deliverables before getting into some of the key research questions that we'll be looking at in pursuit of these deliverables. All right, seeing no hands, I'll scroll on back up. and we can look at some of the key questions that we'll be looking at here. So these are guiding research questions. We don't necessarily need to pursue every single question to the same level of depth, but some guiding questions to get a better sense of what we'll be looking at here include things like how is clean energy defined in Connecticut? What's the maximum production potential? How much clean energy will be available for hydrogen production after accounting for the other energy needs of other components of Connecticut's decarbonization plan? So Connecticut will need a lot of renewable energy to decarbonize its operations, its electric and transportation sectors themselves. And so there's only going to be so much renewable energy potential to actually feed into hydrogen production once you account for all the other uses for renewable energy in Connecticut on their path to decarbonization. Looking at how clean energy that would otherwise have been curtailed can be used to produce hydrogen, how much hydrogen that can produce, what feedstocks are best suited to meet clean hydrogen need. Many questions around equipment manufacturing, what equipment is needed, how much is required, how would a local manufacturing capacity be able to support the development of hydrogen production economy in Connecticut? What would be the impact on local workforces? What are some of the key components of the cost for producing hydrogen, and how can they be addressed? How can hydrogen production be integrated into a larger regional effort to develop a clean hydrogen economy? Would Connecticut be able to export hydrogen? Would it be an importer of hydrogen from states that maybe have more resources to support its production? And what's the scale of hydrogen production in Connecticut compared to other states elsewhere in the hub? Finally, a number of questions around other concerns that are relevant as we start to pursue hydrogen more directly. What are the major production sites? How can environmental justice concerns be addressed? How can we ensure that frontline communities and traditionally marginalized communities are not harmed and actually benefit from this transition? What steps should be taken to ensure that hydrogen is produced safely, that supply chain impacts are minimized, and how can we leverage any existing R&D within Connecticut or elsewhere to support this development? That's a quick overview. Looking at the timeline for when we're completing this, we're currently in September. So each month we'll have one meeting in this working group. This will be the first one. We have another one at the end of October, and going through January when we'll be submitting the final reports to the legislature with our findings. Though you can see in this timeline that there will be another number of opportunities for this team to look at the draft findings developed as part of this analysis and weigh in before it's ultimately presented to the Connecticut legislature. So I'll pause again quickly there before getting into the next part of the agenda, see if anyone has any questions or thoughts on what was just presented. Excellent. Well, moving along, I'll jump back to PowerPoint presentation and start getting into some of the questions around the analytical methodology and initial findings for opportunities to produce hydrogen within Connecticut. So as was mentioned in the guiding research questions in the charter, there's sort of two primary pathways by which hydrogen, clean hydrogen, can be produced, typically using either dedicated sources of renewable energy or what could be termed excess renewable energy that would otherwise be curtailed. And so I put this slide together as a to provide a quick visual overview of how the production potential within Connecticut for hydrogen can be determined. starting with analysis on the total potential capacity for renewable energy production in Connecticut. So the total capacity of wind or solar that Connecticut could conceivably install if it wanted to. From this total potential capacity, we would subtract out the base renewable energy demand, which is essentially the renewable energy capacity that Connecticut would need to decarbonize its economy under normal operations. So to decarbonize its power sector, decarbonize its transportation sector with electric vehicles and other electrification solutions. So once you subtract out that base renewable energy demand, you have what's termed here as unallocated capacity. So the total amount of capacity that could conceivably be repurposed to develop hydrogen or produce hydrogen. Doing some math with the average capacity factors for solar and wind in Connecticut, you can translate that unallocated capacity to the total annual renewable energy generation potential that Connecticut could potentially tap into based on its local resources. To that renewable energy generation potential, you would add back in any expected renewable energy curtailments that would occur under normal course of business in Connecticut based on its expected deployment of renewable energy for decarbonization. So that's where you add back in or take into account the excess renewable energy that could be additionally available to produce hydrogen as a supplement to dedicated renewable energy resources that could be set up specifically to produce hydrogen within the state. Now, all of that added together would allow you to estimate the total energy available to produce hydrogen. And from there, using generally accepted conversion rates for hydrogen or for energy to hydrogen based on electrolyzer efficiency, you can calculate what could be considered the technical hydrogen production potential in Connecticut. This is not necessarily the optimal hydrogen production potential. That would depend on how much hydrogen Connecticut needs and how much renewable energy is feasible to develop under the timeline constraints of the next few decades of Connecticut's efforts. There's no requirement for Connecticut to build out wind and solar across every single acre of land in the state in order to produce hydrogen. But just to get a sense of the total production potential that we're working with, this methodology would allow us to provide a high-level estimate of that. Obviously, this is a little bit simplified. There's other components to this analysis that would have to be included to make sure that we're taking into account the realities of how hydrogen equipment needs to operate and where different resources are located. But as a general approach, I wanted to put this in front of everyone so that there'd be some awareness around the possible way that we could tackle this, one possible way we could tackle this problem. On the right, I've included some definitions for reference about some of the factors that we'd be using in this analysis, as well as some of the sources that we could use to understand the magnitude of these factors. So doing a quick dive into one of those factors, which is base renewable energy demand. One key question to answer before embarking on this analysis is how much renewable energy is Connecticut going to need to decarbonize its economy's regular operations? So how much renewable energy will be needed to decarbonize the power sector, the transportation sector, and other parts of the economy? Because that the renewable energy that will need to be built out for those purposes would not be available for the production of hydrogen and would need to be taken into account. Now, Connecticut's Connecticut has released a integrated resource plan looking at a number of different scenarios for how it could potentially decarbonize its state operations to reach its net zero target, which provides a glimpse into the potential volumes of renewable energy that Connecticut would need under normal course of business. But there are a number of scenarios that this integrated resource plan assessed. As you can see on the left, there's upwards of 10 scenarios. One half of them being considered a base scenario, and the other half looking at a situation in which there's more electrification of Connecticut's economy than in the base scenarios. And even within those scenarios, there's a number of different nuances. So what could be considered the reference scenario, or really the base scenario, would be this balanced blend scenario at the top, which just assumes that Connecticut looks at a least cost resource mix to meet its 100% zero carbon targets. And also assuming that the Millstone nuclear plant retires at the end of its current contract. However, there are other scenarios analyzed that would have Millstone stick around for beyond its current contract, which would reduce the amount of renewable energy or zero carbon energy that Connecticut would need to deploy to hit that zero carbon target. Similarly, in electrification, there are situations or scenarios analyzed in which there's higher electrification of transportation or space heating, and high electrification scenarios where Millstone is extended as well as a number of other options for how Connecticut could approach decarbonization, some with higher emphasis on behind-the-meter solar, some with higher emphasis on transmission build-outs. You can look at this screenshot from the report here on the left to get a sense of what these different scenarios kind of entail. But at the moment, we're looking at the balanced blend scenarios being the primary scenario. And so on the right, you can see what the incremental, some of the inputs from that, or really outputs from that particular scenario. So how much incremental solar capacity is Connecticut expected to need by 2040? How much incremental wind capacity, both onshore and offshore? And then also a predicted regional curtailment rate for electricity based on the modeling in that scenario. And combining all of those factors, looking at how much renewable energy Connecticut expects to have installed under that scenario and how much of that renewable energy is expected to be curtailed, or how much excess renewable energy is expected to be produced, you can calculate how much hydrogen Connecticut can conceivably produce from the excess of renewable energy that would be available essentially for free. And so you can see the output of that calculation at the bottom there. It's about 30 kilotons. Just some initial calculations and analysis to consider as we move forward. So the last slide really looked at sort of the opportunities to produce hydrogen from excess renewable energy. There's also the potential to produce hydrogen from dedicated renewable energy sources, such as setting up a solar plant, connecting an electrolyzer to that solar plant, and using 100% of the output of that solar plant to produce hydrogen. This is a production method that is also employed in another number of hydrogen hubs across the world. And this slide gives a quick look at the potential to do that in Connecticut, particularly from solar, where the majority of the capacity potential is located in the southeast of the state, as can be seen from the map on the right. So the total potential capacity for production of solar in Connecticut is quite large, 27 gigawatts, over 27 gigawatts, whereas only about 3 gigawatts are expected to be needed for base renewable energy demand under the balanced blend scenario provided by the Connecticut IRP. That leaves about 24.5 gigawatts of solar that could potentially be developed to produce hydrogen at an average capacity factor of 16.7%. That could yield around 700 kilotons of hydrogen, so significantly more than you could get from depending on curtailed or excess renewable energy alone. Now, obviously, that is a technical hydrogen production potential. Likely, Connecticut will not be tapping into every single solar resource in its state to produce hydrogen, but some fraction of that could be available for concentrated production in areas where the solar resources in Connecticut are particularly large. There also might be opportunity to combine dedicated or electrolyzers connected to dedicated renewable energy production with the production from excess renewable energy. So, for example, connecting an electrolyzer directly with a dedicated solar source, but oversizing the electrolyzer so that in times of the year when there's an excess of renewable energy being produced, you can maybe push the production capacity of that electrolyzer past the capacity of its dedicated solar resource to take advantage of additional excess renewable energy that's on the system. So that's a quick look at some of the analysis that could be developed and is being developed to look at the potential for solar-powered hydrogen production in Connecticut. We won't go into quite as much detail on the other resources, partly because many of the other resources in Connecticut are a bit more limited. As you can see, wind resources in Connecticut are not as strong as solar, largely located in the northwest of the state. But under a limited scenario view, so putting the greatest restrictions on kind of the siting requirements for wind in Connecticut, there's not a lot of wind capacity available that could become a dedicated feedstock for hydrogen production. Under most of the decarbonization scenarios analyzed by DEEP, there's most of the wind resources in Connecticut, the onshore wind resources would be fully committed. Offshore wind provides a potential opportunity to increase the renewable energy capacity in Connecticut. There's significant offshore wind resources around Connecticut, and it plays a big role in Connecticut's decarbonization strategy and could play a role in its hydrogen strategy as well. However, some work needs to be done to understand where the lease areas for this offshore wind will likely be developed or be opened up, and what that means for the ability to create dedicated hydrogen production zones centered around offshore wind. So Connecticut currently has 2 wind leases in the current set of BOEM offshore wind leases that have been slated for development. If you combine the total amount of renewable energy capacity that Connecticut has contracted for from these wind leases, it totals about 1.1 gigawatts, which is significant. But is already going to be fully committed for decarbonization of Connecticut's normal operations. In addition, these wind leases or these offshore wind leases are not necessarily connecting directly to Connecticut itself, but connecting at a closer shoreline and then being integrated into the regional renewable energy mix, which is a fine system for regional decarbonization of, electricity production or power sector operations, but would make it potentially challenging to develop dedicated offshore wind resources specifically for hydrogen production, because many of the offshore wind being developed to support Connecticut, might not necessarily be connecting directly to the shore of Connecticut, where that power could be fed to electrolyzers and support local industrial hubs centered on clean hydrogen use. And so there's some questions that need to be answered around what the best way to integrate offshore wind into Connecticut's hydrogen strategy would be. Would it be to simply use curtailed energy from wind projects that are that Connecticut is contracted with, or would there be opportunities to actually connect offshore wind systems to Connecticut to power electrolyzers directly, or potentially even site electrolyzers out at sea and move the hydrogen into Connecticut via pipeline? So these are all questions that we're hoping to investigate as part of this analysis. Quickly looking at how the potential production zones for hydrogen Connecticut match up with areas of demand. So the potential locations of off-takers, of users of hydrogen in Connecticut, match up well with existing gas infrastructure in Connecticut, which, it makes sense because many of them are already being supplied by gas transmission lines. But they're not necessarily well matched up with renewable energy production zones. As you can see, a good portion of the potential users of hydrogen in Connecticut here are not necessarily located close to, for example, the areas where solar production is most available in Connecticut. And so potentially as we move forward, we'll have to investigate solutions for this mismatch in production and consumption areas for hydrogen. And this is something that we'll be developing in coordination with the uses and the infrastructure working groups. But generally, for the development of hydrogen ecosystems across the world, it's valuable to be able to site the production of hydrogen closer to the point of consumption, because it minimizes the amount of additional infrastructure you would need to build out to connect supply and demand. So fewer pipelines or fewer trucks moving hydrogen back and forth. So wanted to make sure that that geospatial element was also at the forefront of everyone's minds. As you move forward, there's opportunities also to consider other energy sources for hydrogen production beyond wind and solar. Some examples that are listed in the legislation initially passed by Connecticut that created this task force include nuclear plants, as well as biomass and biomethane, which can also be used to produce hydrogen through gasification, methane reformation. Every single one of these potential energy sources also faces some restrictions. In nuclear, obviously, would refer to millstone plants, which will already likely be running at very high capacity factors to support regional decarbonization or statewide decarbonization already. And so there's a big question mark around how much spare capacity would have to produce hydrogen, as well as, a big question mark around whether there's even an opportunity to develop new nuclear plants in Connecticut to produce hydrogen. Nuclear plants being, particularly difficult to develop, that's something that we would not be able to take for granted as an opportunity. Similarly, biomass and biomethane have some restrictions. They're limited in supply. There's a lot of other competing uses for these relatively constrained and valuable resources, and potentially, depending on how the definition of clean hydrogen is developed, sources like biomethane may not actually fit into Connecticut's definition of clean hydrogen. So that's an overview of some of the analysis that's been done so far, and look at the methodology for that and continued analysis. I want to pause here and provide an opportunity for questions, for discussion. You're welcome to ask any questions you might have on the slides that were just presented, but I have put here a couple of specific questions to kind of center the discussion, and also hopefully to tap into some of the resources on this working group to continue moving forward with this analysis after this working group is completed. So I think a good starting point is looking at the first question. about the methodology that was presented here, and whether or not anyone has any thoughts about how this methodology or this approach could be refined to provide better insights going forward.
I guess if I can jump in, this is Bernie Pelletier with PACE. One question, methodology question I would have is, you more or less plugged in curtailment factors. And two questions, I guess, most basically, where did they come from? And a direct follow on to that would be sort of at what time scale are you assessing them? So is that with hour to hour, is there excess at a given time that's quickly taken up as the day progresses? Is it day to day, or is it season to season? Sort of what's the level of granularity where you how quickly can we switch over to hydrogen production to avoid curtailment?
It's a really good question. So the curtailment factors were taken from the DEEP IRP. That was also the source for the incremental renewable energy capacity that'll be needed to decarbonize Connecticut's economy under normal course of business. But these curtailment factors are not particularly granular. First off, they're regional curtailment factors. So they're estimates of the renewable energy that would be curtailed across the entire New England system. So obviously lacking some granularity there. They're also annual curtailment figures. So it's the amount of renewable energy that would be curtailed on an annual basis. So from a high level, in theory, if you could capture all of that, if you had electrolyzers ready and waiting to capture that energy as it's being curtailed, that's how much renewable energy you'd have available annually to produce hydrogen for free, essentially, or using free power that otherwise would have been discarded. But you're right, a more granular analysis would ideally match up the daily or even the hourly production of solar or excess solar and wind energy, and understanding that, what it would, when that energy will be produced, and therefore when the hydrogen is being produced. There's limitations based on the relatively short timeline for this analysis to get too granular in this respect, but definitely something that would be interested in looking at if there's data available for the annual or daily, hourly curtailment figures for the region, and specifically for Connecticut. I think one weakness of this analysis to date is that we're not looking specifically at Connecticut curtailment rates. We're looking at regional curtailment rates, and obviously, curtailment in Connecticut could be higher or lower based on the expected demand profiles and renewable energy sources in that state. To answer your other question, this is all based on 2040. So the 6.8% was the expected curtailment rate regionally in 2040 under the scenario that DEEP analyzed, and so that would be the timescale that we're looking at. This is essentially how much renewable energy would be available for hydrogen production about 2 decades out from here.
Thank you. I'll certainly just quickly add that in my view about renewable energy curtailment, I think it's going to be in the 2 shoulder seasons. So March, April, May, and starting about now, September, October, is when I think the bulk of the curtailed energy would happen. I think in the darker periods of the year, the less sunny periods of the year, there might be less. So maybe for purposes of this study, we should at least have a monthly view of curtailment, because I think that would speak to how much electrolyzing capacity we need. It won't be a flat number across the year.
That makes sense. And that's a big challenge for kind of electrolyzer development in general. If electrolyzers have pretty significant capital costs. If you're building an electrolyzer just to run in the fall and spring, that those economics are challenging for developers. And so we'd have to look at ways to make sure that these projects are actually feasible to develop from a financial standpoint, maybe by coupling projects with dedicated renewable resources that can feed it power year round, but also oversizing the capacity so that in the shorter months, it can maybe ramp up a bit more to take advantage of that renewable energy that's being introduced to the grid and otherwise would be used. Maybe moving quickly to the second question.
Hey, Colin.
Yes.
Can you see the hands that are being raised in the chat? Or would it
No,
be helpful for me
unfortunately, I
to
can't.
call
I
on?
probably should
Okay. I can
ask
help
for some
moderate.
support there. Yeah, I'd
I can
appreciate
help
that.
moderate. I think Mary, your hand was up first, and then Samantha.
Great, thanks. I just had a quick clarifying question. I believe it was the slide that spoke to the renewable energy additions that would be needed, and that was identified in the IRP under the base scenario and then the electrification scenario. Was that 23,000 megawatts, and then was that 23,000 megawatts of resource additions across the entire New England region or just for Connecticut? I believe I remember from the IRP that they identified, 23,000 megawatts of resource additions under the balanced blend scenario for the base case, and then 28,000 megawatts of resource additions under the balance blend electrification case, but that was across all of New England. So I was just curious, and that of course is to meet the New England states, including Connecticut's decarbonization goals. And so I was just curious, clarification question. How much was identified for Connecticut specifically in terms of renewable energy additions to meet the decarbonization goals studied in the IRP?
Of course, good question. So the numbers here on the right are the numbers for Connecticut. They're the incremental solar, onshore and offshore wind capacity that Connecticut is expected to need to decarbonize, expected to need by 2040 to decarbonize under the balanced blend scenario. I think maybe the 23 gigawatt number you're referencing maybe came from here. And so this number here, this 27 dropping to 24 gigawatts is the total potential solar capacity that Connecticut could tap into if it essentially develops solar everywhere in the state where solar is feasible to develop based on current zoning standards and those types of restrictions. And so that number is obviously much larger than what Connecticut actually would need to develop to decarbonize, but it's a starting point for how much leftover capacity there could be after Connecticut decarbonizes the other parts of its economy to produce hydrogen.
Gotcha. Thanks, Colin. I was just trying to refresh my memory from the IRP and the numbers that were being used here, and that's very helpful. Thanks.
No problem. And I think Sam, you were next.
Yeah, thanks for this. Appreciate the emphasis here on solar and on meeting, our demands that we already have. I think when you look at the greenhouse gas emissions in Connecticut, really the biggest bang for our buck using the solar is going to be, for electricity generation, for transportation, for buildings, as a priority. And then excess can help potentially decarbonize those hard to electrify industries. What came to mind for me and will need to, I think, be fed to the policy group is there is no legislative or within the IRP a pathway to achieving the renewable capacity we need to meet the 100% zero carbon target. And so it'd be really important for that policy group to be thinking about what needs to be put in place in statute to move even to just the targets we need for what exists right now and what needs to be replaced.
Thanks. That's a good call out. Checking in with Aaron to see if there are any other hands.
We do have a hand from Nathan, and then we also have a comment from Bernie in the chat about the IRP and sort of the way that some of these numbers are determined.
Mm-hmm.
But Nathan, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. First, just listening to Sam, I would agree with her calling out that point about needing a clear path and set of decisions for actually being able to get to where we want to go, not just the various options that the IRP does wonderfully lay out. But my reason for raising my hand was I'm just curious in what you've shown us today. I have to admit I didn't see and figure this all out. I probably could have if I paid closer attention. But my point or question is, which of these different sources look to be more practical, all things considered? And it did seem like maybe solar was the answer to that. You had some concerns about offshore wind, both because it's all the capacity there is probably going to be needed to meet the base, but also maybe some locational siting issues. So my question is, do you come away from this examination with a sense of what's more likely to be helpful for being useful for hydrogen production of energy sources, and was solar best, solar or nuclear or both, I guess is what I'm presuming and wondering if you have that thought.
That's a good question. So qualifying that this is a preliminary look, I would say that solar is you're right, probably one of the most promising resources, definitely more promising than onshore wind. A little the mismatch between production and potential demand for solar production and potential demand for hydrogen is something that's not ideal. But you can see there's a decent amount of potentially large areas of large capacity additions for solar in the southwest of the state as well, where there's potentially more off takers, and so the production demand isn't totally mismatched. I think offshore wind, though, once we dig deeper into that particular question, will likely come out as a significant opportunity as well. I think that locationally, there's maybe more challenges there than solar. Just siting production of offshore wind closer to demand for hydrogen might be a challenge because it is offshore. So barring the development of large transmission lines, to connect that offshore wind directly to the Canadian coast, I think the most likely situation is offshore wind will be developed, not pretty far from the Connecticut coastline, but Connecticut will contract for that electricity and use the majority of it to decarbonize its typical operations. But just because of the magnitude of offshore wind that Connecticut will need, and the overall, the pretty large capacity factors that exist for offshore wind, which are not don't follow the same diurnal schedule as solar. So a lot of that capacity would probably be around at night when the other normal demand for electricity in Connecticut is lower. I think there is a lot of opportunity for Connecticut to tap into energy that would otherwise have been curtailed from those offshore wind installations and use that to produce hydrogen as well.
That's really helpful, and I agree with what you're saying about the enormous potential of offshore wind, and I like what you're saying about the timing. So anyway, thank you. That's great.
No problem. And looking at Bernie's question real quick.
Yeah, Colin, go ahead on Bernie's question. Then I have just, I guess, one comment to make for folks' consideration.
Yeah. So as you said, Bernie, we want to be able to dig into this too deeply at the moment. But yeah, the numbers from the IRP, these incremental capacity figures, that were on the other slide are capacity additions. And so, not all of that capacity will be available. It'll be, based on the production cycle and the capacity factor. And so that's definitely something that needs to, we'll dig into in more detail as we get further into this.
Thank you.
I guess the one thing I was going to make about this is I think, Colin and the team have laid out a really, really helpful view on in-state resources. But the really wonderful thing about hydrogen hubs is that you get to leverage your neighbors. And so, I think one of the things that will be useful for us to think about, especially as we go through this process and also think more substantially about uses, is, how much hydrogen are we trying to produce from in-state resources? Are we comfortable planning to be a net importer of hydrogen? So kind of some of these strategic regional energy supply questions. And I think as we get into uses and sources and as Colin starts to tease some of those threads and bring them together, I think that'll be a really interesting question for folks to dig in on.
That's a good point, Aaron. And to expand on that, one part of the analysis that hasn't been developed yet is the cost factor. So, how much would it actually cost to produce electricity from these different resources within Connecticut, based on capacity factors in the state? And what would that mean for the cost at which you could produce hydrogen? And it may be the case that, even from the available resources within Connecticut, it's relatively expensive to produce hydrogen here versus importing power or hydrogen from other states connected to the hub. So yes, there's no requirement for Connecticut to produce a substantial amount of hydrogen within the state. If that doesn't seem to be the most feasible or beneficial route, there are other ways that Connecticut can participate in this regional development that will be developed, both here, but also in collaboration with the other working groups that Aaron mentioned. Maybe pausing on this slide real fast before I see we only have a couple of minutes. I would love to get the perspectives from the group on which of these scenarios might make the most sense to develop. I know we have a representative from Dominion here, and so one question that we're working through here is, how likely are these different scenarios to come to pass? Does it seem likely that Millstone will be the contract for Millstone will be extended? Is there a lot of momentum in Connecticut to develop a higher electrification scenario? Are there any scenarios from this IRP that seem like they would be more valuable to model from a hydrogen production perspective?
So, Colin, I can jump in on that. Wheezy Noir from Dominion Energy, and I appreciate the question, and I certainly support the group looking at the Millstone extension scenarios. Of course, we have the power purchase agreements through 2029, and that covers about 55% of our output, so 9 million megawatt hours of Millstone's energy each year. Those contracts are performing very well for the state right now. It's the utilities that buy the energy from Millstone at $49.99 a megawatt hour, and then they turn around and sell it into the wholesale electricity market. So this year alone, it looks like they're going to earn about $500 million on those contracts, which gets returned to ratepayers. So the contracts are performing well. We don't know whether they will be extended at this point in time, but we're certainly hopeful that Millstone will be continuing to operate for many years to come. So I would fully support including the Millstone extension scenario. It's a resource with a capacity factor over 90%. So it really is a key resource to leverage in terms of abundant carbon-free electricity. So fully support you including the Millstone extension scenarios in the analysis.
Thanks, Wheezy. So I see we're at time. I don't know if there are any other hands raised, but I'm happy to take follow-up questions over email. We can send out these slides afterwards, so everyone has them for the reference. And it would be great, if you had a chance to reflect on the presentation a bit more, and the questions at the end of this presentation, to send me any thoughts you have based on the questions posed there. Great. Well, thank you all for joining. I'll let you all jump and get back to your days, but looking forward to working with you over the next few months.
Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks all.
Thanks, Colin.